Welcome to episode 4 of the Improving at Warmachine series. Today we're going to talk about the range game and how to approach it, how to deal with it with kind of like list selection and everything. My name's Ryan. Used to be good at Warmachine. Welcome to Spell Rack. On this week's episode of Improving a Warmachine, we're going to focus on the analysis of the range game. I want to start by looking at this at list selection. I think it is important that when you're looking at a pair of lists, you decide how range heavy their lists are versus how range heavy your lists are and how that's going to change the outcomes of the matchups. If you're playing a faction like Signar, oftentimes Khador, it could be Chimera, Gravediggers, even Dusk now, certainly even Orgoth. You have opportunities to have a pretty significant ranged attrition game. And if you are the superior gun line, it's going to change the way games are approached. When I list build, one of the lists that I normally build is a list that plays into a gun line. That's something I want to think about for any faction. I play Dusk now, I'm picking up Orgoth, and I think through lists frequently with other stuff. I used to play Crix, I used to play Signar for Mark II, Mark III days. But I always had to have an answer for what happens when I'm dealing with a gun line. Crix, it used to be, maybe too many models. Maybe it was a stealth skew. So these days with Dusk, I have Tyrus. I have long threat ranges so I can get across the field. I have a lot of shield guards, and I have options for stealth. Plus, there's the spell rack to offer me deceleration. If you're Gravediggers, maybe you're looking at a cloud wall from the Rowdies. It just depends. I feel like in any list pair, you need an answer to a gun line. You need to figure out what that list is. And then when you sit down to the table, you need to figure out if you think your opponent's going to drop that gun line. The list selection of it is something you just kind of need to get used to. You need to figure out if that range superior matchup, let's look at Signar, right? There's a lot of gunline lists. And then you have Calder, which has Crusader's Call. And so you have one list that's probably going to be a gun line, and you have another list that's going to charge really fast. Current Dusk pairing for me is Tyrus, really fast, Helith, gun line. And so you're going to have to figure out which list you're going to play against. So you'll need to approach that on an individual match by match, faction by faction basis. But I think it's important to pay attention to it as you're approaching the game. Once you figure out which of your lists is going to play into those range matchups, you need to make sure that list is properly set up for it. It's probably a good idea to have defenses. You might want duck and cover. Just because you're playing into their range skew doesn't mean that they're necessarily the dominant range matchup. It might be that you're the superior range list. And so that's sort of a question too, is who skews harder into the range game? They could play a range dominant force and you play an even more range dominant force. You can both bring your defenses. You can both bring your duck and covers. You can both bring your decels or deflections or wind walls. But if one of you is the ranged advantage list, you get to poke down the second list in a superior manner, and it forces that second list up to mid-table and pressuring scenario more so than the list that has the range dominance. Okay, so let's step away from that extreme skew case. When you are playing into a gun line, again, no matter what your list is, you need a way to get across the table. You need to get to the midfield. You need to get into their lines. And so you need to be really thinking about, again, is it defenses? What spell rack options do you have? Do some of your solos or your units have shield guard or grant shield guard, and that helps you get across? Can you manufacture stealth? Can you put a couple of heavies out that can hide a key piece that you need up the battlefield so that it doesn't get removed, but it has threat application? In the case of Dusk a lot, I'll put Mirage on a unit of cats and hide them behind a forest, and then I Mirage into the forest. And then I can get out of the forest, and that gets me across the battlefield. It gets me into the gun line pretty quickly and easily. So it's going to depend on each faction, but you need to have a plan. If your list design and some of your playstyle tendencies are not ready to get across the battlefield, you're just going to get shot off the field. And so you need to plan. And maybe I'm stating something that's obvious here. I'm not sure. It's just one of the first things that I do when I list design is how do I deal with the range game? And honestly, there's some factions, this is a play style thing for me. I like to answer things in certain ways that fit how I want to play the game. I would struggle more with the way other factions challenge range lists. You know, if it's the idea of like just absorbing shots, I have a harder time with that. I struggle with that. I need more concrete answers than that. But if you're a player that says, you know what, I'm just going to weather the storm on the way in, then it changes the way you play the game. I might play cagey with shield guards and hiding behind forests, and maybe it takes me a little while to approach the game. And maybe I get behind on scenario because I'm being cagey. Maybe you run a list that says, you know what, I'm going to take it on the chin, but I'm going to run everything. Maybe you have a defensive feat. Maybe it's defense, maybe it's armor. And what you do is you just feat run across the field. You're on all the objectives. Now you're keeping that range list at bay because it doesn't really want to come into you. It's going to stand still and shoot you really hard for a turn. But the difference is what lives from you is now at the center of the table and can get into their lines. Maybe it's charges, maybe it's just running, right? Because a lot of gunline stuff doesn't want to be engaged. So you might just engage some gun units that are the now kind of stock. What it does is it pushes your front lines forward. It allows you to stay on the objectives while keeping their guns less effective. And the other thing to consider here is tempo inside of the game. If you are the range list, you need to decide how heavily you want to commit up front. Do you want to give up points on scenarios so that you can maintain your ranged advantage? If you are the gunline list, do you have certain units or characters that can run up and contest objectives? You know, what is your plan for that? Because you need to be able to approach the midline as the gun line, just like the non-gun line player needs to be able to approach the gun line. Again, there's a lot of theory and thought that goes behind this stuff, and then you execute it on the tabletop. The other item I want to mention is being able to go first, or if you're not going first, selecting a table side. And this can matter a lot because if a gun line gets to go first and is playing against something that's not as much of a gun line, let's just say, that gunline list gets to, just say everything's speed 6 for argument's sake. That entire army is going to be 11 inches up the table. Plus they're 6 inches deployed. They're 17 inches up the table. They're 7 inches off the midline, which means they can just walk and shoot and effectively be at the midline on their turn too. So for the player going second, if they walk to the midline and they shoot 10 inches, now they're shooting into 10 inches onto your side of the board. And so you need to be very careful with where you are placing. And so if the gun line goes first, you do need to make the decision of, are you playing an aggressive game? Are you going to feat, hopefully defensively? Hopefully that's an option. Are there walls? Are there trenches? Are there buildings? Are there forests? Are there hills? Are there ways to mitigate the storm that you're about to weather? And do you run everything? Do you just bite it at, just take it on the chin and go? Or do you play cagey? If you play cagey, you can look at your opponent who's on the midline and say, okay, well, you can walk 6 and shoot 10. That's a 16-inch threat. You started 6 inches up the table. You ran 11. That's 17. And then you can threat another 16. That's 33 inches. The table's 48 inches long. So I'm 15 inches outside of my table edge. Second player deploys 11, which means I walk everything up 4 inches. I walk everything up 4 inches and I say pass turn. And then I see what the range player does. If they can't quite reach me, now maybe they're kind of stuck. Maybe they just say pass turn, or maybe they move up a little bit. Maybe they take a few shots. But now if they're giving me stuff at the midline and I'm that second player, now maybe I have a chance to charge something of theirs. I'm going second, so I get a chance to go score scenario first. Maybe I have the opportunity to run some pieces. The other side of the equation is if you're not the gun line and you're going first, you get to full run your army, right? And so your army is 6 inches up and then everything runs 11-ish and you're 17 inches up the table. The player that has the gun line can't shoot you turn one. You're just probably too far away. So they're probably going to run, but just outside of your threat ranges because you're not the range dominant army. And so then again, it brings up the question of how do you want to play the game as that non-range person going second? They've come up but they're out of your charging threat ranges. Maybe you can take a few pop shots here and there, and you could really start to create an attrition game. Again, do you have a defensive feat? Can you come up on them really heavily and just try to bully them off of scenario, knowing that they're going to attrition you, but it's a race on scenario? Do you back up, give them table space so you don't get shot? And the reason I keep asking a lot of questions and I'm not giving answers is because it's going to change game to game, and you need to be adaptable. You need to be able to decide, is this a cagey game or is this a full commit game? Is this a game where I try to sandpaper some pieces and I kind of pick somewhere in the middle? Okay. And it's going to change based on matchups. I've had games where I would say something that I was really good at back in the day playing Cricks. Cricks were just known for shoving all their models forward. And I did not shove all my models forward. I played a little bit cagier with Cricks, even though I had 50 models, it was the play I played 50 models that was different that got me across the table. The way I play Dusk now is pretty cagey. I will oftentimes give up scenario early so that I can keep my pieces and hopefully secure a reasonable alpha that pushes me back onto scenarios. Sometimes that bites me. Sometimes I give up scenario and I go down 5-1. I need to get to 3 and leave them at 5. Sometimes that's doable, sometimes it's not. Sometimes in exchange for that winning the long attrition game, I give up the scenario game. And so again, that's a careful balancing. It's just keep in mind these things. Are you aggressive? Are you cagey? Can you press scenario? How much scenario can you give up? And so I really, really think a lot about the range game at list creation, at list selection, at deployment. And we'll talk about some of that other stuff more another time. This is what I think is really like one of the most important parts of the game as you walk up to the table and as you build your lists. This is like my first thought is, how do I approach the range game? All right. Thanks for watching this one, everyone. Like and subscribe. Until next time, thanks.